Syracuse to celebrate the International UN Day for stopping impunity for crimes against journalists. And now we give the floor to the Chief Prosecutor of the Italian Supreme Court for an introductory speech. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for the patience in letting me speak first, but there is a reason for that. In a few minutes, we have a session of the Higher Council of the Judiciary, where we are going to discuss a very important issue that has a direct impact on the freedom of information. We must decide, or we must express an opinion on a decree, on a legislative decree that concerns the enforcement of the European Directive on the presumption of non-guiltiness, and that can have a clear impact on the way in which journalists may properly obtain information and just as properly inform public opinion. So, of course, this is a session of the Council I want to attend. I absolutely want to attend, so I apologize, but as soon as I complete my contribution, I will have to leave. Here, behind me, there is a poster that was given to me by Mr. Spampinato, who is the director of Ossigeno per l'informazione, when he came to see me many months ago. This is not its usual position in my office. It is normally placed somewhere else, but I wanted to put it as a backdrop to my speech, because here there are the pictures of the journalists that were murdered in Italy, and so this image is in my office, together with another photo, the one representing a group of young women and young men in a square of Turkey, and they are protesting precisely for a free press. After a few moments of the broadcasting of this selfie, a bomb exploded and they will be killed. But, well, of course, we remember journalists who have been murdered. There are very many of them. Luckily, Italy managed to get out of the tunnel where it was till a few years ago, with many journalists being murdered together with politicians, judges, and people belonging to law enforcement agencies. But still today, there are many journalists, 24 if I'm not wrong, that are under police protection 24 hours a day. This is a clear indicator of a real risk existing for the lives of those who work in the area of information, and also it is clear evidence of the commitment by the Italian state to protect information. In Rome, in recent years, we had journalists that were threatened, and also very seriously so. They were beaten, but the reaction was a very, very determined one. Well, first of all, by the judiciary power. The authors of these threats and beatings were identified and prosecuted. And there was also a reaction by the public opinion, and that, well, of course, created serious damage to organized crime after these aggressions against the freedom to inform. Well, Italy has followed a line, let's call it that way, to protect information, but this pathway is not completed yet. If we have followed the route of protection of journalists, we are looking for a good balance between the guarantee of the moral freedom of the journalist, which is just as important as the one pertaining to physical danger, especially when the journalist must must face issues that are extremely important from the political and economic viewpoint. So when he's faced with really major centers of power, and even the threat of severe sanctions, criminal sanctions in the case of libel, well, that may have an effect on the moral freedom of journalists. And in this respect, progress was made, both in terms of case law of the Supreme Court, that in its interpretation of the provisions, the Supreme Court also envisaged that you may have imprisonment in cases of severe libel accusations, but they limited this possibility only to the most severe cases, with a sort of decalogue for judges, and the Constitutional Court stepped in as well. First, with a decision by the Constitutional Court whereby they invited the legislators to make a clear decision in this respect, and so making legislative choices that mirror the different interests that are at stake. But after 1 year from that first decision of the Constitutional Court, since there was no action by the legislator, by the legislative power, the Constitutional Court declared the illegitimacy of the provisions that exist in the law to limit the possibility of imprisonment only to the most severe cases of libel. In general, the court declares inconstitutionality or the abidance by the Constitution of the piece of legislation they are considering, but considering precisely that this is a very sensitive issue, they set a time frame to the legislator, hoping that the legislator, understanding the importance of the problem, would reach an immediate solution, which was not the case, unfortunately. And so the Constitution had to step in and make a decision so as to have a clear interpretation of the provisions. So the safeguard of the freedom of journalists, which is essential. I hope that this image, this picture just standing behind me, well, this group of photos is every day in my office together with another photo, reminding me of the importance of safeguarding the freedom of information. Sorry, no microphone. Fava was murdered in 1985, and I have a strong memory of his presence in the civil and political debate in the city of Catania. Microphone off. Microphone off. We can't hear the speaker. Microphone. The freedom of information is oxygen not only to the information itself, but by all of us. Thank you very much, and I apologize for for being the first to speak. Anyway, thank you. We wish to thank Dr. Salvi, who introduced the discussion that will go on today with our guests and the different speakers of this roundtable, and will be dealing precisely with the issues that Dr. Salvi has listed so effectively, reminding us of the state of the art in the fight against impunity and safeguard of journalists in Italy. Of course, we fully understand that you have an institutional commitment, so that you are going to leave us immediately. And now I give the floor to the Mayor of Siracusa, Mr. Italia, for a welcome address.
Welcome to Siracusa, and thanks specifically and particularly to Ossigeno per l'informazione and Unesco for being here and for having set such an important meeting here in Siracusa. Siracusa is UNESCO World Heritage, but not only. Siracusa has been declared city for peace and human rights. Therefore, it's very coherent to our mission
today here. Therefore, I'd like to thank also François, Thony, and the Syracuse Institute for Criminal Justice and Human Rights, because of his amazing work which has been held throughout all these years. What I have to say is that I confess you that these numbers I read about crimes against journalists are really, really alarming to me. I didn't know at all such numbers. UNESCO Observatory reports that 1,200 journalists have been killed all over the world, and what makes these numbers even more shocking is that the majority of them have not gone punished, are unpunished. Therefore, it's very important what we're doing today. I make mine the words of Dr. Salvi, which is saying that protecting journalism and protecting journalists means to protect our societies, because especially nowadays with the increasing and the growing fake news, social media hate speech, it's very important that our journalists work in a safe environment, because have a safer journalism means to have a safer and more free society. Therefore, thank you for being here, thank you for your knowledge, and thank you for sharing such an important event in our beautiful Siracusa.
We thank the Mayor of Siracusa for these very important words underlining the welcome of this city on these issues. And I mean, we are not speaking only of the personal safety of journalists, but also the protection of a fundamental value in our democracy. And now I give the floor Tawfik Jelassi, who is UNESCO Assistant Director General for Communication and Information.
My sincere gratitude to the General Prosecution Office at the Italian Supreme Court, also to members of the judicial community, media professionals, and fellow colleagues for participating in this major international event. I also would like to thank our partner, Ossigeno per l'informazione, for organizing this timely discussion at the Siracusa International Institute for Human Rights and Criminal Justice. This shows the importance of preventing impunity for crimes against journalists. As presented in the War Strands Reports Insights paper on the safety of journalists, published on the occasion of the International Day to End Impunity, UNESCO has recorded 400 killings of journalists worldwide in the past 5 years. Last year alone, 62 journalists around the world were killed just for doing their job and informing the public. I would like here to mention that just over the last few days, we monitored the killing of at least 3 journalists in Mexico and in the Philippines. This happened just on the eve of our International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. Moreover, the level of impunity of these killings has remained extremely high, with an impunity rate of 87%. close to 9 out of 10 killings of journalists in the world remain unpunished. But the killings of journalists are just the tip of the iceberg. Journalists are increasingly subject to other threats, ranging from imprisonment, kidnapping, torture, and other physical attacks, as well as to harassment, especially online. Women journalists are especially impacted by gender-based threats and attacks in the digital space. According to a recent Unesco discussion paper, 73% of the women journalists surveyed said they had been threatened or harassed online in connection with their work. Threats of violence and attacks against journalists instill a climate of fear for media professionals, impeding the free circulation of information, opinion, and ideas for all citizens. Too often, threats against journalists culminate in their killings. A recent study developed with the support of UNESCO has shown that out of the 139 murdered media professionals in Latin America between 2011 and 2020, half of these killings had received threats related to their work. The message is very clear. We need judicial action to end impunity, not only for killings, but also for all other crimes against journalists, both online and offline. Because if we don't address the threats, we risk being too late when we try to address the ultimate attack. For this reason, this year's commemorations of the International Day focus on the importance of investigating and prosecuting threats of violence against journalists in order to end the cycle of impunity and prevent further crimes. Today's roundtable discussion will encourage a dialogue on prevention and protection measures to address the safety of journalists and highlight the instrumental role of prosecutorial services in investigating and prosecuting not only the killings, but also threats of violence against media workers. Attacks of all types against media professionals have a major impact on society as a whole because they prevent people from making informed decisions. Recently, we have seen how misinformation and disinformation linked to the COVID-19 pandemic has caused terrible damages, and how access to information based on facts and science is essential for society. We have seen journalists being attacked, and how this gives free rein also to attacks on scientists and on doctors. When journalists are attacked in impunity, it undermines the rule of law for all. Today's discussion on how to tackle this issue will notably be informed by the guidelines for prosecutors on cases of crimes against journalists, developed in partnership with the International Association of Prosecutors. The guidelines are now available in 17 different languages, including Italian, thanks to the assistance of Ossigeno per l'informazione and the Siracusa International Institute for Criminal Justice and Human Rights. It is our hope that these guidelines will be a useful tool for public prosecutors in Italy and worldwide to strengthen special protocols and methods of investigation and prosecution of cases involving journalists. Since 2013, UNESCO has been strengthening the knowledge and capacity of members of the judiciary on international and regional standards on freedom of expression, access to information, and the safety of journalists. Through UNESCO's judges' initiatives, over 23,000 judicial actors from around the world have been trained on these issues. In the framework of this initiative, I am pleased to announce that next year, a comprehensive training course for prosecutors will be organized in Syracuse. This training, organized in cooperation with the International Association of Prosecutors and the Syracuse International Institute for Criminal Justice and Human Rights, this training will provide prosecutors and trainers of judicial academies with practical and operational tools for investigating and prosecuting crimes against journalists and related issues. Let me end by saying, only by investigating and prosecuting all threats and crimes against media professionals can the cycle of impunity be ended, and the fundamental rights to freedom of expression and access to information for all be guaranteed. I would like to thank once again our partners in this endeavor, and I wish you all a very fruitful discussion today.
Thank you very much for your useful contribution, one that surely helps us frame the discussion that is going to follow. Actually, we from Ossigeno per l'informazione are also honored and grateful to UNESCO for cooperating with us, for having already cooperated with us for some time. And the same goes for the Syracuse Institute that is hosting us today. Therefore, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Jean-François Thony, that is the director of the center. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear Francesco, the Mayor of Syracuse, authorities, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, our mayor has been so nice as to speak English, so I would like to do the same and speak Italian for thanking him for hosting us in this beautiful city. Indeed, it is a great honor for us to have you here. This is an important round table, of course. Its title is Justice and Freedom of the Press: How to Stop Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. It is promoted by Ossigeno per l'informazione, a Rome NGO, under the special mandate of UNESCO to celebrate the UN World Day for stopping impunity for crimes against journalists. It is a special pleasure for me to recall at this stage that the Italian President of the Republic has bestowed the launchers of the initiative with their special medal. Indeed, this speaks for the Italian President, Mr. Mattarella's attention to whatever pertains to the safeguard and promotion of human rights. When he came here 3 years ago, this is precisely what he said. I believe we all remember that time. And I would like to speak on behalf of the Institute here to warmly thank Ossigeno per l'informazione and UNESCO for choosing Syracuse and our Institute for their meeting, for their event. This is a city that boasts an ancient culture that started at the center of the Mediterranean, basically being a geographical and cultural bridge between the Western and the Eastern civilizations. It is indeed recognized as a human rights town. And as for the Syracuse Institute, well, its primary goal is to improve the protection of human rights, to combat criminal activities, and spread the rule of law worldwide. We owe this to the determination of Professor Sherif Bassiouni, whose painting you see on my right-hand side. He was the president of this institute for quite some time, and it is considered as a mentor when it comes to human rights. So this institute is a center of excellence, worldwide known and recognized by the UN as such. Its work is basically focused in rather three different areas, namely to provide different country governments with technical assistance regarding prosecution, and they also organize training courses for judges and lawyers in the field of international cooperation and the fight against the organized crime. And thirdly, we are committed to research projects in these fields. Since 1972, over 720 events have been organized by the Institute, thereby training over 61,000 lawyers coming from over 170 countries in the world. This is also why I'd like to stress at this stage that choosing our institute as the venue of your event goes hand in hand with the objectives that your initiative aims to pursue. Actually, today's speakers will allow us to engage in definitely high-quality debate on a topic that is unfortunately more and more topical indeed, especially in those areas where the organized crime flourishes. Based on all that, for over the last 2 years, our institute has launched, together with Unesco and the International Prosecutors Association, an initiative whereby its efforts on these topics have been improved in order to allow prosecutors and the justice sector more in general to be able to work within a wider scope when it comes to fight against the crimes against journalists. As the previous speaker has said, the first fruit of such cooperation is provided for by the guidelines for prosecutors about the crimes against journalists, and of course the relevant training events that will regard prosecutors from all over the world. The first one of these events will precisely take place here in Siracusa. Before giving the floor to our speakers, I would also like to recall that this institute has recently been involved in an important European achievement, namely the approval of the resolution and recommendation adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on the right to knowledge. And here there's a special session devoted to the freedom of the press, of information, which includes the protection of journalists for whatever may threaten their own safety. So, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for being here, and I'd like to say that, of course, on my personal behalf and on behalf of the Institute, welcome here, and of course I wish you will have a fruitful event. Thank you very much. I'm now going to briefly introduce you to the heart of the matter, the one that is at the center, that is going to be at the center of our debate, hopefully a swift one, as all debates are supposed to be when the people involved are people who share the same interests and are therefore not interested in reading out from written texts. We really want to consider the discussion that will follow as a fruitful time of contributions from all of us. So let me, for that, in that respect, let me be very brief indeed, and we are all supposed to keep the time constraints because we're going to have not more than 1 hour and a half for that debate. So because of that, I will start by thanking the Siracusa Institute, the Siracusa International Institute. I'd like to thank its president for his kind words. Well, actually, we know that this institute is a partner with whom we're going to move forward based on the fact that we do share some important interests as the deeper study of whatever pertains to prosecution, in particular regarding the freedom of the press. And I may also mention the specific training of judges who may not be properly trained in the right to information. And by the way, this does not only go for faraway countries, but it may also go for our own countries, not because our judges are ignorant people, of course, but because this very much goes with the evolution of our society, whereby training may not always catch up in spite of the many efforts and initiatives that even this very institute carries out. And this is very well done in Italy, by the way. So, let me now also thank the President of the Italian Republic, who is always deeply sympathetic with our initiatives. He has clearly said how deeply he appreciates our initiative, so much so that we've been bestowed with the special Italian Presidency Medal for that. I'd also like to thank the weekly magazine, the Italian weekly magazine L'Espresso, a media partner of our initiative, and the several journalists who are with us on an online basis. Actually, the Sicilian Journalists Association has made that possible. And I would also like to thank those who have contributed by either sending videos or writing papers about the topic of today. In particular, I'd like to mention here the message we got from Mr. Roberto Fico, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Italian lower chamber, lower house. Well, the message also orbits around the need for considering once again the piece of legislation to stop reporting, reckless reporting or claims. And I would also like to thank the Commissioner for Human Rights, Julia Mijatovic from the Council of Europe. Well, the commissioner who has written a text in which she says, well, we're not supposed to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. in other words, national governments are not supposed to reinvent the wheel, all over again. That has already been the case. And the same goes for a worldwide known expert, William Horsley, a close friend of ours, so to speak, who has once again reminded us that this is not year zero for us. I mean, we know what we are supposed to do, as we read in the Council of Europe's recommendation, namely its board, whose members in 2016 wrote several recommendations. We know, unfortunately, that not one of them has ever been implemented. And then Mr. Andrea Di Pietro, our legal consultant, I would like that together with the trade union of journalists from Lazio, central Italy, well, together with them, and thanks to Maria Grazia Mazzola, a close friend of ours, well, together with them, we decided we should make one more step forward. Namely, we have tried to draft possible bill, or at least an article of a possible bill precisely regarding crimes against the freedom of the press and against journalists. But please go back to, try and go to our home website, because there you will find all these messages. Thank you. I'd like to thank the speakers for accepting the challenge of being engaged in such a swift debate. As I said, they will only have a few minutes each, which possibly implies that they might not have the chance to be as clear as they might want to. But once again, I'd like to stress the fact that the debate will be rather, swifter and less long than usual. So, as I'm sure you've already read, what we want here is to answer an obvious question. In other words, we may want to engage in demonstration, in protests against the many threats that journalists are often submitted to, in order for them not to spread any more disturbing truth, Well, we might be engaged in that, of course, but is there anything more tangible than that we may do? What measures could be adopted to that purpose? Well, we've heard that from Mr. Salvi earlier on. We know, therefore, that also thanks to our monitoring work, we know that in the lapse of 10 years, those who said these things simply never happen have been discredited through the huge number of data, the enormous evidence that precisely says the opposite. But there must be something more than we can do, because we need to make one more step forward, namely to choose some measures to be adopted and to implement them. So what we are supposed to do today regarding Italy, but not only Italy, regarding other European countries too, which means we're not talking about the whole world here today, Namely, we are basically talking about what could be done in those countries where, luckily enough, the rule of law prevails, where democracy guarantees the possibility for people to speak freely, but apparently that is not always the case. When it comes to, reality, there are many violations of those rights, and they usually go unpunished. I'm sure that many of you know that in Italy we actually took a sample, if you wish, of those journalists who have survived threats and retaliations here in Italy. And we know that impunity in Italy in the past few years was around 93%, and in some years that rate went somehow lower than that because of some activities that have been launched to that respect. But this is what the current Italian temperature tool seems to tell us. There have been times when something more was done, actually. So now it's time we should move out of a rhetorical approach, just paying lip service to all of that, to actually allow the facts to prevail. Of course, I fully share the dismay of so many international organizations, representatives, when they realize that the freedom of the press is endangered, and every year more so. Well, we're here to hopefully break this chain. Hopefully there will be a time when we say, well, the situation has not worsened. Some things can be done. So let me conclude by saying that our NGO, Ossigeno per l'Informazione, wants to share our experience with you, the experience acquired in these past 10 years. Namely, what is this knowledge? Well, first and foremost, we clearly understood, as the Commissioner for Human Rights has repeatedly said, that there is a lack of political will to actually implement some specific and hopefully effective measures. There's a lack of awareness of how serious the situation is, also from those groups that seem to be the most threatened by this. And another thing we have clearly understood is that what is at stake does not only concern journalists, but democracy as such. So, we believe that by sharing the existing best practices as well as the recommendations and proposals that we are already aware of, well, by doing that, we might indeed find the way to move on with UNESCO and other organizations. Hopefully, we'll even manage to find a new strategy to break this chain. So, having said that, I'd like to show you a video. It's a UNESCO video for celebrating the International Day. Further to which, that is in 3 minutes' time, we're going to start with our speakers. So I am going to ask Mr. Eugenio Albamonte to come here to the podium. He's the Vice Prosecutor from the Prosecutor's Office in Rome. Thank you.
We now give the floor to Mr. Albamonte, then we'll see the video in a minute. Welcome. I have, well, no, a question for you. I'd like to introduce you by saying that Mr. Albamonte recently has dealt with some crimes against journalists, and we met him, we of course were the observers on how the judiciary deals with severe violations of the right to inform. And we were studying a case. In our opinion, in some cases, as the aggression in Ostia against the journalist that was interviewing a member of one of the local criminal families. Well, but in that case you don't have only physical violence, the actual beating, but there is something beyond that. 2 or 3 years ago there were some episodes that seemed to say that investigating magistrates and public prosecutors had taken a different approach. But more recently we have seen that that is not always the case. You have the floor, Dr. Albamonte. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here. It is, of course, a very challenging topic, because this topic is part and parcel of my professional activity. In fact, the issue of aggressions against the freedom of the press may be subdivided into 2 fields. There is this sort of intolerance vis-a-vis the freedom of the press, and so we have the aggression coming from organized crime, so from Mafia itself. But there is another area that is also that may also be cause for great concern, is the aggression coming from political illegal sectors. Well, I've been working on the crimes against the state, also by political groups, extremist political groups. For many years I have worked on groups belonging to the extreme left, and now I am also studying this linkage, the linkage existing between football fans and politics. In the world of sports as well, there is the intolerance of some radical groups vis-a-vis the freedom of the press. Normally you speak of investigation journalism, but sometimes also sports journalists are the victims of intimidation. And recently I've been working on crimes linked to extremist groups of the right rather than of the left. So we must frame this phenomenon into a wider picture. Well, populism is a sort of underculture of of the society and of politics, and it has 2 essential features that of course clash not only with the freedom of the press but with many other things. The lack of intermediaries, the idea that they want to reduce all the hinges of the political, cultural, social system of the country that are considered as obstacles to the direct participation of citizens, to the different areas, to the different sectors of civil society. And then the refusal of complexity. Everything's simple. You just need a slogan. You just need a catchphrase. There is no need for reasoning. And this, underculture that is spreading not only in Italy but all over Europe, certainly in the Western world, in the United States, in the most advanced democracy, and this clearly clashes with the word of communication, of the professionals, of the media professionals at large, because in fact media professionals are intermediaries, and that is why they cannot be tolerated. And they provide a sort of articulated interpretation of reality. They are not simplistic. They provide an analysis of what's happening around us. All this is very far from simplification. So this initial analysis leads me to say the following. Unfortunately, but maybe also luckily, because the reaction must be sort of more comprehensive and more holistic reaction, so that the different objectives of this attacks must sort of join forces, because this reactions doesn't apply only to media people but also to scientists. And in Italy, this is coming sort of second vis-a-vis the United States, where on the issue of pandemics, scientists were also really physically aggressed. The judiciary falls victim to this violent aggressions. Some institutions in this country, we have had really waves of this violent aggressions of the highest institutions of the state. The Constitutional Court, the head of state, and also some areas of politics, especially that area of politics that try, to set limits to these movements, to these undercultures, and political criminal activity belonging to the extreme right are within this underculture. They are the advocates of this populism, and there is this very strong link between some extreme right movements and the no-vax movement. What happened in Rome some weeks ago is clear evidence of this attempt by some political areas of the extreme right that sometimes, some of them, permanently will use violence as a tool for a political fight. And they try to become sort of leaders of this populist approach. So we have had a variety of aggressions. We have the aggressions that are more obvious, and there are, those that have just been mentioned, but there are also other forms of aggression, especially when there are public demonstrations, and these aggressions are against journalists who are there to do their job, to tell about these episodes, to tell about these events. And so there is a mechanism we might want to think about. I organize a demonstration, I organize a protest, but I don't tolerate that the professionals of information stay there to document that event, that narrative, whatever is being said in that demonstration. And so this is something that is worth thinking about, because it is based we should analyze this phenomena, because there are some sectors that are sort of shifting communication from the area of traditional information to the area of horizontal information. They think they can organize a political meeting and at the same time spread information about the contents they are involved with. So this is something that cannot be ignored. Usually, in these cases, there are violent aggressions against the media people who are present there. So threats, private violence, and in some cases, well, they were even robbed, because sometimes, well, they seize, I mean, these people seize also the tools of their trade, so to speak. And I share the proposal by Ossigeno to start thinking about the possibility of envisaging a specific offense or an aggravating circumstance when the victims are people who are present precisely there because of their political, social, professional duty. So they are carrying out a service, the service of documenting what's going on. I mean, you may have a given offense, but then the offense becomes more severe if you are attacking, say, a public official. So we might envisage aggravating circumstances for these people who commit these offenses against people who are in charge of guaranteeing information. And then there is bogus action, specious lawsuits, or this libel suits that are totally unjustified, and that should involve essentially prosecutors who should consider with great attention these libel suits against media people. Libel suits, for example, through the web. Most professional information has also web sites. And so we wanted to inform, I mean, it was necessary to inform prosecutors dealing with libel suits. Sorry, microphone off, microphone off, microphone off. We can no longer hear the speaker. And so to decide upon the threshold of criminal relevance, so whether to decide to prosecute or not. In most cases, then journalists are acquitted, but of course that is also an economic burden for the journalists and also for the media they work for. And then it is a sort of intimidation as well, and so creating a sort of self-censorship of journalists, which is possibly the most serious risk. And there is a third idea I'd like to share with you: hate campaigns. Because hate campaigns on the net, these hate campaigns belong to that underculture I was talking about initially, because they involve all the segments, institutions, politics, the judiciary, and these hate campaigns are not only virtual, because sometimes they also move on to action. There is a spontaneity, of course, on the net, but there is also the organization of these actions. There are networks that refer precisely to organized groups or political movements, or they use tools through which they can multiply the presence of these comments on the net. And these hate campaigns then are sometimes taken up by people who belong to the public sector or to some institutions, but there is a clear responsibility of people who work in the public sector, and they must, in theory, make a clear distinction between legitimate criticism that is possible vis-a-vis the journalist, vis-a-vis the judge, vis-a-vis the prosecutor, and of course, whenever a journalist gives an interpretation of some phenomenon, he can be criticized, but not retaliated or threatened. So there is a clear responsibility also of politicians and sometimes there is also physical aggression. So there is an issue where we must have international cooperation. Here I'm thinking about Unesco. At present, there are great difficulties at fighting hate campaigns and libel campaigns on the net. And because most of these platforms are in the United States, where there are practically no limitation to the freedom of expression, so some offenses are simply unknown in the States. This was done in other sectors, for example, racial hate. I mean, social media must, of course, carry out some vigilance vis-a-vis these actors, these stakeholders. And there is another area, the area of the tracing of trafficking on the net. It is essential to trace the traffic on the net, precisely linked to some social profiles. And over the last few weeks, we have had a limitation of the powers of prosecutors in this tracing. So we speak so much about a fighting of addressing this hate campaigns, but then we do very little in guaranteeing the tools that have proven quite effective. Thank you. And now we give the floor to someone else. I hope that we may have later on time for a dialogue, so that you can also step in again. So I'm giving the floor to Marilu Mastrogiovanni. I appreciated your observations, so we'll have further opportunity to discuss them. I am glad that you like this idea of creating this specific offense of creating an obstacle to, or hindering rather, information. And we have also considered a proposal that is very interesting, that was, well, for the first time it was formulated by the Anti-Mafia Parliamentary Commission in a report on precisely on the threats to journalists. And the idea is sort of unpacking the present, defamation in Italy is an offense. To make a distinction, at present it is a more general type of offense. It is even libel by mistake, sort of an offense by mistake, or I mean a medical error during surgery. I mean, it's a distinction between malpractice, say, by a doctor. So malice, or with or without malice, this is the type of distinction that would be introduced, with or without malice. And so that type of libel, that is not this inappropriate use of information for hate campaigns, that is an offense, but is not even libel. So the idea was that of decriminalizing libel. Now we give the floor to the next speaker.
Marilu Mastrogiovanni is an Italian journalist. She is now living in Bari, southern Italy, but in the past, the past few years, she was actually involved in founding a newspaper where she would talk about a series of events orbiting around the way that the way to somehow not comply with the anti-mafia legislation by some companies. For that, she was forced into leaving her hometown because of the threats she received. So she's very well aware of what an intimidation is like. Marilu is also the president of the jury of the Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Prize, a highly prestigious journalism award. Marilu, what are we supposed to do today to actually protest? Thank you very much, Alberto. Well, actually, the newspaper was founded in 2003. Il Tacco d'Italia was its title, and it was an investigative journalism newspaper. So it went on for 18 years, during which time I was really threatened of any sort of violence. So physical threats, but also, online threats. I also was the victim of some attacks. So, as I said, I knew all the possible types of threats, including vexatious actions. Actually, in 18 years, I was the object of some 100 of them, but no conviction. What did that entail? Well, I'm going to tell you briefly, because what I really want you to pay attention to is the conclusion of my speech, which will revolve around some proposals. So, judicial proceedings face to claim force journalists into paying, for their defense. From Ossigeno's monitoring, we know that most of the times the file is simply dismissed. So when the prosecutor asks for that dismissal, then there's no real reason why that should not occur. Well, actually, that basically means that journalists are supposed to have to pay money to get a solicitor, and then the journalists are often taken to court through a special decree whereby journalists must stand trial because the prosecutor issues a special warrant, and therefore journalists must stand the trial. No previous investigative time is supposed to be shared with the journalists. Right now I am under judicial proceedings which imply a forced charge, in spite of the fact that two different prosecutors asked for actually filing those charges. Four different investigative, inquiring magistrates asked for me to be forced into standing for trial. My newspaper has also been seized and encrypted for several days, in spite that is against the Italian constitution. For 45 days, the right to knowledge was simply lifted. Re-examination occurred and that seizure was lifted, but that had been a violent action against the freedom of the press, but also Article 21 of the Italian constitution, and for that nobody pays. I believe magistrates should be liable whenever they make mistakes too. And right now there are many claims for some newspaper articles published online to be removed. Actually, Article 700 of the Italian Constitution envisages the emergency, the urgency of a standing trial, and anyway, I have recently been spared that, but not in terms of the expenses that I was supposed to bear. And then, of course, justice is very low in Italy, and therefore I may have been convicted into paying independently of what may happen once the whole process goes on, when, for example, it is demonstrated there is the clear evidence that the fact never occurred. In the meantime, I'm still supposed to pay. And then sort of a bureaucratic stalking is what takes place through the different bodies that are somehow involved. Newspapers are often asked by the guaranteeing the moral custody guaranteeing body in Italy to sometimes remove the articles, or at least to provide with more data. In spite, these data are public and therefore are perfectly available also to that body, but this makes it all much more cumbersome and lengthy for us journalists. This is something that should be coped with. I have certainly gone through the guidelines, and Chapter 6 precisely orbits around gender crimes and other forms of hate crimes against journalists. I know through the Unesco monitoring that over 2/3 of women journalists are threatened online, thereby, being forced into becoming the object of also physical violence. I have been the object of 4,000 mail bombing actions in which I was threatened with death. I, of course, filed my claim with the postal law enforcement agency, and nothing has ever happened, even though the investigation clearly showed that there was someone in particular to be held accountable for that. Now, the conclusion of my presentation, as I said, revolves around some proposals. The crime of opinion should be ruled out. I know how difficult that may be because of the many consequences this may have. So if that is not possible, however, at least the press derived defamation or libel crime should be reviewed. We should not, in other words, take it for granted that we as journalists have published fake news on purpose. It may simply have been a mistake, as it goes with all professionals. Hence the relevance of a professional insurance policy that is not available to us right now, although it is the case of all other professional categories. This might enable us to cover the proceedings expenses, not to mention the damage that we are the object of for example, some hackering activities to our websites. So the defamation crime should involve an administrative sanction rather than a prosecutorial action that might basically be, you know, a criminal punishment, so to speak. And then another proposal may be the following. The judiciary and the news people should be engaged in an open and based on trust relationship. You may know how difficult it is to have access to files. Sometimes this happens because of such good relationships. So I believe that such good relationships, sometimes ambiguous, I might add, imply that the news that is published may be used as instruments in a biased way. I think this is a risk that we should remove, because journalists should have access to files in a perfectly transparent way, as it goes with all electronic evidence. I mean, the right to information is a right of all people. Therefore, even journalists, journalists first and foremost should be entitled to have access to such files, to all investigative files. Thank you very much, Marilu. You've kept the time schedule, and your contribution is surely precious. I'd like to highlight two parts of your speech, but before that, I'd like to call on Guillermo Canella to come to the podium. So, as I said, I'd like to stress a couple of issues that were included in your presentation, in Marilu's presentation about the proposals. One about the right to oblivion. So, this notion of oblivion. I mean, we know that the claims for removing online news, well, such requests are becoming a bit too many. I believe because there is a lack of the relevant legislation. I mean, there is one in Italy, but one that is a very general one, whereby it is a non-judicial body, the Garante per la Privacy, the privacy guarantor, that is supposed to deal with that, but we get nothing that goes either with what would be the case if the judiciary were involved or the relevant staff. So it seems like everything should fall under the category of what is most serious. It feels like a dictatorship, really. And then Marilu also mentioned the issue of the special, the insurance policy special for journalists. Actually, in Italy, for example, it seems like malice is supposed to always be the case. Therefore, we're not supposed to have a specific insurance, as it goes with all other professionals. And now Guillermo Canella has the floor. He is the head of the section for freedom of the press and safety of journalists from UNESCO in Paris. So he has a worldwide perspective, and therefore he will have to realize what I said at the beginning, namely, we live in democratic countries where the rule of law prevails. In spite of that, we still have problems. But of course, wherever the rule of law does not prevail, such problems get even more tragic. So, Guillermo, how can we reconcile these two issues, democracy and the rule of law on the one hand, and dictatorships on the other hand?
For Ossigeno per la informazione and the Syracuse Institute for co-organizing with UNESCO this very important discussion. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very sorry I can't do this in Italian, although my grandparent was from Padua, Italy. For some reason, many Italians that immigrated to Brazil, as you can notice, I'm Brazilian, they kept many traditions, luckily enough, particularly food, but they didn't keep the language for us. So that's very unfortunate, but I hope I will correct that soon enough. It's a pleasure to be here with Alberto, also with my dear friend Marilu. As Alberto mentioned, Marilu is the chair of the UNESCO Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Prize. And I would like to start mentioning this because obviously we are discussing here today, unfortunately, dramatic issues. But I would like to start with a word of hope. A few weeks ago, as you all know, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee decided to award this year's Nobel Peace Prize to two journalists that are very much connected with UNESCO and with the Guillermo Cano Prize. Maria Ressa, a Filipino brave investigative journalist, just won the UNESCO Cano Prize earlier this year in May. And Dmitry Muratov is connected with a particular newspaper in Russia, from which a few years earlier Anna Politkovska came, and she also won the UNESCO Guillermo Cano Prize. And if you remember correctly, the announcement of the prize by the Peace Committee, they said they were awarding the prize to these two particular journalists, but beyond that, they were awarding the prize to journalism as an oxygen to democracy. Without journalism, we can't breathe properly. Without journalism, we can't protect other rights, aside the right of freedom of expression itself. That's why, Alberto, it's very common with authoritarian regimes that when an authoritarian gets to power, he or she, they do two things. Normally he's and not she's, but they do two things. They censor the press and they limit the independence of the judiciary. So freedom of expression and rule of law are really united here in guaranteeing our rights in general, not only freedom of expression. So that's why UNESCO, as the Assistant Director General has mentioned earlier, and Thony as well, have started a few years ago this initiative that we call the Judges Initiative, through which we have already engaged 23,000 judges and prosecutors and other judicial operators from 150 countries. And this is another word of hope. Judges and prosecutors all over the world are interested in this issue. It's just a matter of offering to them the opportunities to discuss a very complex issue. The Mr. Prosecutor from Rome that spoke first, he touched very complex issues. How we deal with hate speech, considering the difficulties of the jurisdictional problem, what most of those companies are based elsewhere. How we deal with the acceptable limitations to freedom of expression according to international law. All those things are not easy issues, or the so-called right to be forgotten, that, by the way, does not exist in the universal system of human rights or regional systems outside Europe. So those new issues, or the transparency of the judiciary, access to information within the judiciary, all those things, they require specialized knowledge for judicial operators. So I'm glad to tell you that if you open the UNESCO toolkit for judges and prosecutors, you will find all those issues covered in that document. And the trainings we have been offering with different universities all over the world, with Texas University for Latin American judges and prosecutors, with Pretoria University for African judges and prosecutors, with Oxford Bonavero Institute for Human Rights for global judges and prosecutors, you will find exactly those discussions. So the way of moving forward here is, in keeping the independence of judges and prosecutors, is to find ways to cooperate among those issues. We find very commonly that there is a discrepancy that is mainly originated because there is a lack of dialogue. A lack of dialogue between journalists and judicial operators, a lack of dialogue between international institutions as UNESCO and judicial operators and journalists. So what we are doing here is needed, and we need more of that. But we need that with a concrete horizon, what we want to achieve. And what we want to achieve from a judicial point of view is the ending of the impunity cycle. We need to prosecute crimes against journalists, from one hand, and we need to stop prosecution against journalists that is not in line with international standards of freedom of expression. The so-called SLAPs that is very much present, unfortunately, all over the world, including in Europe, it's another form of violence against freedom of expression. And let's make no mistake, it's not a violence only against Marilu or any other journalists. It's a violence against society. Because when those players used or misused the judicial system to stop journalists to bring truth to the light, what they are doing is creating silent zones for the entire society. And there is a responsibility among judicial operators to not accept this. Those are strategies to create a world of fear. Those strategies to increase self-censorship, to create a chilling effect in freedom of expression. So at the same time that we need to prosecute crimes against journalists, we need the judicial system to protect freedom of expression and press freedom in every decision related to this. And this is no favor for journalists and for the society. This is what your countries have agreed when they ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Is what your countries have agreed when they are saying they are in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the regional treaties, the European Convention on Human Rights, and so on and so forth. So those international standards that costs humanity 75 years of intense discussions, 2 world wars, they are absolutely fundamental to also be incorporated in every decision that are taken by national jurisdiction. So this is our challenge, and it's not easy, because every time I'm talking with judicial operators about freedom of expression issues, the first question I get after I spoke the introductory remarks is how we limit freedom of expression. So if this is the first interest, and there are, of course, legitimate elements to limit freedom of expression, we are starting the discussion with the wrong foot, because this is not the main problem. The main problem is precisely how we are keepers of freedom of expression and not restrictors of freedom of expression. And it's not easy, because, as I said, there are complex discussions here. In the 1 minute I have left, 2 things. There is interesting international jurisprudence in some regional courts, particularly the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, that are underlining that it's true we have some speech that is not authorized speech and therefore can be restricted under international law. So, for instance, hate speech that leads to violence is one of them. But the Inter-American Court has also underlined another very important aspect. There are many speeches that are especially protected speech. And one of them is the speech that criticizes public figures. It's part of the job of public authorities, including judges and prosecutors, to be criticized. And they need it's part of the job description. And therefore, they need to accept this. So make no mistake, when we look to defamation cases, we look to rights to be forgotten cases, they are not cases against the average, involving an average citizen, involving my mother. They are cases involving politicians, public figures that don't want to be criticized by the press. And you, members of the judiciary, should stop that. So, to finalize, our challenge here are how we prosecute threats against journalists, how we prosecute crimes against journalists on one hand, but on the other hand, how we protect freedom of expression as a value for democracy and rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo Canela. Thank you for your considerations. I fully share. Now we have a 15-minute break.
Dear participants, I'm honored to welcome you on behalf of the International Association of Prosecutors to this webinar within the IEP Unesco Syracuse Institute initiative. It follows a solid partnership of the IEP, UNESCO and the Syracuse Institute to develop valuable products. IEP's network is based on helping each other, learning from each other, influencing, stimulating to keep up a decent level of fair and independent prosecutions, a common way of acting, so to say. Also in countries where judicial systems are under pressure, openly or otherwise. Every day, prosecutors around the world work tirelessly to ensure that perpetrators of crime or violence are brought to justice. This course raises awareness of the specific issues related to crimes against journalists and identify the elements of the offenses that should be analyzed and the safeguards that can be put in place to make the prosecution of perpetrators more effective. Since 2006, over 1,200 journalists have been killed around the world, with an impunity rate of 87% according to UNESCO's data. In addition, journalists are subject to countless other threats. Threats of violence, attacks against journalists contribute to a climate of fear for media professionals, impeding the free circulation of information, opinions, and ideas for all citizens. In knowledge of this alarming trend, it is essential to raise the knowledge and an agreement with UNESCO in 2020 to cooperate on addressing the issue of impunity for crimes against journalists. Since then, the IEP and UNESCO have jointly developed guidelines for prosecutors on cases of crimes against journalists, which identify key elements to consider in the decision-making process when an alleged crime is committed against a journalist, and propose a series of elements to consider when proceeding with the investigation and prosecution. For the three partners, the IEP, UNESCO and the Syracuse Institute, this international course for prosecutors on investigating and prosecuting violent crimes against journalists is the first course. The course is based on these guidelines. Sabin Olet from Canada, who was the main author of the guidelines, and I'm happy that he is with us today presenting these guidelines to you. Dear participants, some of you might be individual members of the International Association of Prosecutors, some might be member under the umbrella of an organizational membership, and some of you might not be a member. Allow me just a few words about this global operating organization of prosecutors and for prosecutors. The IAP has three main goals: assisting with learning from each other, with capacity building, that's the first one. The IAP Global Training Academy is organizing trainings together with IAP's partners, among them Unesco and the Syracuse Institute. Today's training is a good example. I already touched standards for prosecution. Through its networking, trainings and support, the IAP provides to raise standards and improve international cooperation between prosecutors. The guidelines are a good example of this. The IAP publishes these standards and norms for good and fair prosecutions among its members, and the IAP stands up for the interest of its prosecutors, such as their safety. And the most recent and visible example of the IAP caring about the safety of its members are the dramatic events in Afghanistan. The IAP is assisting the Afghan prosecutors with their visa and asylum procedures. Last but not least, the IAP is connecting prosecutor services and prosecutors through its worldwide network. The IAP is represented in more than 170 countries, and that network is about finding each other in the fields of mutual aid in all areas of prosecutorial expertise. That could be terrorism, cybercrime, international crime, anti-corruption, wildlife, military prosecutions, and others. The IAP will soon launch its Prosecutors International Cooperation Platform that will assist prosecutors to help finding each other and to assist each other. I hope that this webinar will make you appreciating the work of all organizations involved, Syracuse Institute, the Unesco, and also the IAP. I'm wishing you a very good webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to use your recommendations, and we're certainly going to hopefully comply with the principles included in the guidelines, a tangible tool for us to actually also consider the currently existing Italian proceedings, to consider them under a proper light, because there may be connections with what journalists do. Having said that, let me give the floor to Mr. Wella.
Dear President, distinguished guests, dear colleague prosecutors, dear participants, I'm pleased to be with you for this roundtable today. I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to participate in this meeting and present the guidelines for prosecutors and the steps to go beyond the guidelines. Let me be frank and direct from what I heard since the beginning of the morning, because I was there for the first session. We must speak, of course, about the tragedy of men and women and journalists dead defending the cardinal principle of search for truth, killed to expose the corruption of the political elite or the criminal organizations, and to make accountable the political apparatus and administrations. And it must be done so that they are not forgotten and that their struggle are not trivial. We must speak about the supranational basis, convention and treaties, which are one of the foundation of our democracy, apart from our constitutions contained in international conventions. And it is also important to do so as a base for public action and a base of argument to promote awareness. But we also need other things. In a society like Italy or Greece, built around the principle of the rule of law, member of the European Community and European Union, with strong political and administrative environment, It is about coherent public policy that we need. A public policy that set in motion all levels of the state to defend freedom of expression in all its forms. Journalists here present must become activists, as a group, of course, activists of this important reform, which must be put on the political program, on the political spectrum. Unesco have an important political level to be the broker of this emerging public policy. Pressure groups can be organized, and all communities must act on the freedom of expression. IEP and UNESCO has made an important contribution to the scaffolding of this emerging public policy. It is the guideline for prosecutor. But this is only one part of this edification. We must amend descriptive indicators, performance indicators, and even political indicators to be sure that we implement a global policy, a comprehensive policy in our society to all aspects of the administration. But the guidelines offer a description of the best practices that we prosecutors can do about the problem we face. First, in the guideline, we recommended that prosecutors receive specialized training on fundamental rights related to the exercise of the role and function of journalists and the protection of journalistic sources. Sometimes it's not always well known. So when conducting and supervising or providing advisory assistance to an investigation in relation to an alleged crime committed against a journalist, prosecutors should identify specific measures for the protection of confidential journalistic sources, including advice on the handling and management of journalistic material, which is a very important aspect of our role. The prosecutor should initiate or recommend contextual analysis. This is key to our position. The contextual analysis of the nexus between the alleged crime and the media activity, past and present, of the victim. The contextual analysis is to guide the investigation out of a tunnel vision and to take the work of the journalist as a starter to evaluate possible perpetrators. Secondly, when authorizing proceedings, the prosecutor must analyze, of course, both the sufficiency of the evidence and the public interest in initiating such proceedings. This is the work we all do all the time. Decision must be taken, of course, fairly and partially and with integrity to secure justice for victim, witnesses, and suspect and defendant, and the public in general. But transparency and accountability regarding the decision taken in the conduct of proceedings are crucial to the value of justice and equity. In the pursuit of the truth, all perpetrators, including the planner, the financiers, or the originators, should be prosecuted when there is sufficient legally admissible evidence to do so. As part of the opportunity principle analysis, and I want to put emphasis on that, the prosecutor must evaluate public interest, and which include among factors maintaining public confidence, of course, in the administration of justice, weighing the effect of the decision on the public order, considering a fundamental right that could be hampered or violated by the commission of the alleged crime against a journalist. This is very important. And the assessing whether a victim has been specifically targeted because they are journalists and are undertaking journalistic activities. At each stage of the investigation, before authorizing proceedings and during the proceedings, prosecutor must take steps to ensure the protection, preservation, and integrity of the evidence relating to the case. Thirdly, confidentiality of journalistic sources must be protected. Consequently, journalistic sources are confidential and should be treated as such at every stage of the investigation and the judicial proceedings. Apart from highly exceptional circumstances, journalistic sources of information which could lead to the identification of the source should not be consulted or made public without the journalist's express consent in agreement with the source. Or if it's not possible, of course, in case of killing, by the media organization associated with the journalist and still with the agreement of the source. In the highly exceptional circumstances where lifting the confidentiality of journalistic sources is the sole investigative element for the resolution of the case, all information or evidence that could lead to the identification of the source should be sealed and submitted to a competent judicial authority to determine the condition of use of and treatment of that information. In the absence of such judicial process, prosecutor will have to determine whether there is an overriding and proportionate, the two of them, imperative and public interest to lift the confidentiality. Fourth, not only a protection program like you have in Italy, and I heard in the first hour that there is several action in this protection program, but also a keystone part of the investigation is the use of collaborator of justice in order to ensure the conduct of proceeding for certain serious crime offense against journalists. It may be necessary to call in witnesses that have been involved in the crime to request certain advantage in return of their testimony in order to prosecute those who are the financier or the origin of the threat and the action, let's say, of the crime against the journalist. Finally, and I want to be quick on a few issues that I know that are well known by prosecutors in the room. Finally, a gender-based crime and other form of hate crimes on journalists. The issue of crime against journalists is raised globally, where the investigation and prosecution of these crimes calls also for combating violence against women journalists. Men and women journalists are both exposed to violence and threat to their safety during the performance of their duty. However, women journalists are exposed to different forms of gender-based violence, including rape, sex harassment, and other forms of intimidation, including threat. Those guidelines provide the framework in which public interest decisions should be made in context of gender-based against journalists and any other form of hate crimes. When exercising their duty to charge crimes against a female journalist, a prosecutor may proceed with conducting a gender analysis by examining the underlying power relationship and other dynamic that determine whether discrimination was a factor or a motive in the commission of a crime. Such analysis requires, of course, an understanding of difference in status, power, role, and the impact of hatred when weighing the evidence and examining the motive in the commission of the crime. But what do we go beyond the guidelines? Well, the next steps is, as it was mentioned by the other speakers and by Anne Morale from the IAP, is that we are working currently on building a 5-day training course with the IAP, Unesco, and the Syracuse Institute. It will be a very practical training course that would drive prosecutors into each item of the guidelines. We will deepen not only a solid legal base to the action of prosecutors, but also a wide variety of exercise to put into practice, essential element of comprehension of method of investigation, prosecution, and closure when crimes against journalists are committed. Confidence into the administration of justice plays an important role when it comes to prosecution. Most countries in the world are working to implement best practices in this very specific field, and UNESCO, IEP, and Syracuse Institute have worked closely in that. So now it is time to, this is just a fraction of the work, and it is time to to look for a more global strategy, an action plan to implement a real public policy. And we can all be actors in this movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting indeed. Hopefully we'll have the chance to be on your side when this international activity is launched, possibly also through the organization of different events whereby to reach out to all users of information. This is a field where there's still a lot to be done, because what is often missing is the generally professional knowledge that is more often than not necessary for allowing those involved in defending one's ability to actually carrying out one's own profession. We are certainly involved in the drafting of an international plan from 2020 to 2030, namely about an information action for journalists about the issue of the right to knowledge and to information. Hopefully this will be starting soon. Actually, we might want to ask the Syracuse Institute and you for some help. And now the anti-mafia national prosecutor Federico Cafiero de Rao is going to take the floor. Actually, he could not be present until now because he has been involved with 4 different district attorney's offices in Italy. Actually, he has a lot of work to do, in spite of which, however, he is always very aware of our issues, and is very dear to us, to our NGO, because 2 years ago he drafted some proposals with us, actually quite interesting and quite peculiar, I might say. The proposals regarded the Italian judiciary. Well, I would talk about them by saying that according to Mr. Cafiero de Rao, there is also a legal problem when it comes to the legal status of all journalists who right now are not entitled to any of those prerogatives that may go hand in hand with their degree of responsibility, and also considering their socially relevant role, face to which they might want to be differently considered also in order to get some help when they must cope with the kind of abuse that is typical of vexatious actions or claims for damage that are not well-grounded at all. So, 10 minutes for you, Mr. Cafiero de Rao. Please take part in our debate, in the debate that is being held here at the Syracuse International Institute for Criminal Justice and Human Rights. You have the floor. So, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Ossigeno NGO for being so deeply aware of this important issue and for pursuing such relevant aims. Actually, we're here to talk about the freedom of the press, indeed a pillar of democracy, hence the relevance the action taken by journalists based on their important social role to claim for more protection. I believe such a protection should regard journalists' safety as such, so they are supposed to be defended against threats, and on the other hand, their protection should allow them for getting reimbursements when they are supposed to pay or to be involved in vexatious actions. In particular, I am thinking of those journalists who often publish data or stories about those involved in the organized crime. They're basically on their own. They are exposed to retaliations, and we have some very obvious examples: Daphne Caruana Galizia, Juan Kuciak, and I may also mention Victoria Marinova, even though it is often said that it was only, so to speak, an act of sexual harassment or sexual violence, and I would like to apologize for using the adverb only. I might also mention Maria Grazia Mazzola here, who, just because she was involved in an interview, has been attacked and seriously hit. So we get several examples of threats to the freedom of the press. And let us just consider that up until last August in Italy, as many as 111 cases of threats to journalists were reported. Well, why should a journalist be threatened? Well, basically because they do not have the protection of a newspaper behind them. And actually we know that some topics are usually not included in their regular activities. The topic of the mafia or the mafias is one that for most newspapers seems to have lost much of its relevance. So mafia and corruption are topics that are coped with by non-professional journalists who therefore are benefit from an even lower degree of protection. And then in Italy, we have a sort of an automatic mechanism whereby journalists being threatened immediately become the object of the action of some law and order agencies, law enforcement agencies that work within the area where the journalists are based. So an ad personam kind of a protection is started. Sometimes they may be under police protection with even a car that may be bulletproof, a police car. But of course, we may need something more, namely a better structured approach of such protection of journalists, especially considering that some of them are truly exposed, and this precisely happens because they are on their own. There's no newspaper editor somehow supporting them. And there's also a publisher issue, because if mafia and corruption are no longer typical topics of newspaper stories, well, this may indeed be maybe because editors are not interested. They might be interested in something else. Well, an investigation has actually taken place precisely showing that some newspaper editors were apparently connected to Ndrangheta organization, which of course does not mean that all newspaper activities are to be labeled like this, and this does not mean that editors should not be considered in terms of their degree, their professional degree. However, if some non-professional journalists are particularly well exposed to the organized crime or to threats, it is precisely because they cope with topics that are not normally covered by regular newspapers. Another problem has to do with a regulatory framework whereby journalists can be protected against such a vexatious action. This is particularly true of those journalists, as I said, that are basically on their own. They do not belong to any newspaper publishing house, so they are often the object of many claims entailing huge amounts of money, which means that journalists do not feel free to do their job. So I believe we should consider some models, some different models of protection for them. For example, once a claim is filed, damage claim is filed, if it proves to be a vexatious action, well, then the one who has actually brought to justice the journalist may indeed have to pay twice as much to the journalist. In other words, sanctions should be envisaged through an innovative mechanism, because actually today the news is something that is a pillar of democracy. Knowing about what happens in the world means that the whole population is enabled to get to know even the most sensitive issues of politics, for example, which means that the journalists involved are definitely exposed to threats, whereas they should be, their work should be guaranteed, because, by the way, the Italian constitution wants such rights to be guaranteed, hence the relevance of today's event. I believe the people of the press should be enabled to keep doing their job, because they are indeed a pillar of our democracies. I think that's all. I believe I have kept my time schedule. I wish to thank Mr. Spampinato and Ossigeno. Thank you again. Thanks for having me, and I wish you a fruitful webinar.
Thank you for this excellent contribution to our discussion. I know you have other commitments. I don't know whether you can stay with us or not. And now I'll give the floor to Mikhail Albanese. He's a journalist. You know very well. You know him very well. He's under police protection due to threats coming precisely from Ndrangheta. I'd like to inform our participants and also those who are online, that we are very grateful to Dr. Derao because he has been discussing with us all these issues for some time now. You will find on our website all the useful contributions we have received so far, and there is also an interview by Dr. Derao in 2019, an interview with us where we spoke about an aspect that is not truly considered in Italy, i.e. that in fact, and I mean, we sort of agreed on that, but it would be useful to create specialized prosecutors' offices precisely to deal with crimes against, offenses against journalists. And in the interview, that is something that is being discussed with the pros and cons, also considering that a more specialized training is required in young prosecutors and in young magistrates, so that this right to information is part and parcel of their awareness. Mikhail Albanese is a story, first of all, and his story represents clearly epitomizes the tragedy of the problem we are talking about. He was a free man, a journalist, and a journalist. He was a happy journalist, certainly quite well known, and he had a number of scoops in Calabria, that is his homeland. He was very well aware of what was going on at the Gioia Tauro area. It is a container port that is possibly the most important in Italy. They have built this port in an area that is controlled by mafia families, but I mean, it is a very mysterious place because, in fact, there are no railways or other or motorways connecting Gioia Tauro with the rest of Italy. So it is quite mysterious why this huge port was built there. And one day he was told, well, you are under police protection. You will have two police officers next to you. Mikhail is here with us because this service is operational, and journalists, of course, trust the protection of the police. And when we give the floor to Elena Kanadiakis, who is here sitting next to me, Kaniadakis, and she will tell us that this is not the case in Greece, because in Greece obtaining police protection means that you are no longer free to work, to be a journalist. We all know about your story, and so here I give you the floor, and of course you can say whatever you want for 10 minutes, but I like for you to make some proposals, both for setting you free, but also for setting free all those who, like you, because they wrote what they could see with their eyes, they lose their freedom, and that also applies to their families, and they can no longer see a light at the end of the tunnel, and they suffer a punishment and a very serious retaliation simply because they are devoid of their freedom. And after 7 years, this danger has not disappeared, so to speak. And so you have the floor. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you for the invitation. I wish to thank UNESCO. I wish to thank all those who organized this day because, well, of course, you provide a heightened attention, not so much for some journalists, but for information at large. There is intolerance prevailing, intolerance vis-à-vis those who describe a fact, a right, a paper describing the situation where this has happened, and so describing the situation around a given fact happening. Well, these people are at risk. I discovered some time ago that there was someone who wanted to murder me. I discovered it thanks to a recorder that the police had placed in a car, and so we understood the plan that was being devised. I'm still worried, because 20 days ago 3 Italian prosecutors' offices, Ancona, Brescia e Reggio Calabria, arrested a person who had killed someone else due to a transversal vengeance. This murder was due to vengeance, and it was discovered that these people had bazooka and hand bombs for murdering people under police protection, and I was in the list. So that was discovered thanks to a bug in a car, a bug that had been placed by the police when I thought that my adventure was almost over and I could go back to everyday life. Well, of course, this episode brought me back, not so much in a situation of fear, but concern, essentially, of the effects that these risks imply, especially for my family. Well, I can give my life for my land if this is necessary. I know that in that region, of course, much is at stake for Italy at large. What 'Ndrangheta has become has been explained by Chief Prosecutor De Rao, and all the judges tell us about that. And what is the situation in a land that is devastated by the 'Ndrangheta approach and power, and many collaborating witnesses, many victims, the wives, the mothers, they are doing something quite different. They are the one element of hope in Calabria. Calabria today is at the center of a set of dynamics that have been investigated too late, and so it is a sort of crossroads of crime, mafia, corruption, and that embraces Italy, but not only Italy, all nearby countries. There was, for example, Daphne Caruana, Carizia murder, Giancu murder, as mentioned by Prosecutor Mr. De Rao. Some movements are extending their activity. The 'Ndrangheta organization in Calabria and the links they have with other countries are a danger to freedom and democracy. And those who try to fight it, well, law enforcement agencies with regard to investigations and, of course, prosecutors with regard to the judicial system, and information trying to describe what's going on and what's going on around some actions, trying to to carry out a sort of social recovery because this land was tramped on, insulted, but Calabria wants to get out of this situation. I've just tried to carry out my job. That's it. And to do that, for telling the true story, now I've been under police surveillance, police protection, for 7 years and a half. So I don't think I am an inmate or a prisoner of freedom. Quite the opposite. I consider myself a free man, despite all the threats, thanks to the intervention of the state, and thanks to these police agents, police officers that are accompanying me in all my movements, because the social professional isolation, that risk is present. Apart from thanking Unesco, apart from thanking Ossigeno per l'informazione, I wish to address a clear invitation, an invitation to responsibility to my colleagues. We must recover our own responsibility, our own accountability. Even though the journalist at present is going through a different moment where all the forms of mediation, and of course the journalist is after all a cultural mediator, he tries to mediate between the facts that happen and his or her readers or listeners, also describing the prevailing situation in a given country. So despite all the attacks, not only with specious lawsuits, but even if you listen to the news, purely to the news, well, you see that almost daily you have an attack against information, against media people. You have demonstrations, and in demonstrations also camera crews are being attacked, journalists are being attacked, and we are, why? Because this is a very difficult moment at the social level, and the forms of conflict, the denial of democratic forms or civilization, and of course that implies attacks against the media. Well, this is a danger for democracy, individual and collective freedoms. Those who don't understand that, well, these are people who don't understand what's going on today in Italy and in Europe. Information has become everybody's foe, and information is protected only by those who truly understand the role information has in a democracy, as is the case in Italy and, of course, elsewhere as well. So, responsibility, credibility, so respecting, well, ethical, professional ethics, avoiding inappropriate or forced forms of communication, and first and foremost, trying to protect local media people, without which, as Prosecutor De Rao just said, some issues are no longer dealt with. Say Mafia, the Mafia issue, corruption. Well, these issues are better explained at local level, by local media rather than national media, because as Prosecutor Mr. De Rao said, well, sometimes their publishers are not, let's say, pure or unbiased. They have other objectives, not essentially the editorial ones. And there are many colleagues in our country who manage to survive, and sometimes putting their own life at risk. If we don't understand that, well, that means we wouldn't have understood anything of what's going on in the information world in our country. And some methods are expanding. After reading the Jan Kuciak story, or after the investigations of Daphne Caruana Galizia, we see that there are aspects that, whereby organized crime, money laundering, politics are sort of relayed. And one of the places that has experimented very sophisticated techniques of such mechanism is precisely my region, Calabria. And that is why we must, analyze well and understanding the different mechanisms of corruption, money laundering, and so on. Some figures just to make you better understand. First, trust. Eurispes carried out an investigation on trust. 7 Italians out of 10 answered that they don't trust anyone. They don't trust institutions, politics, trade unions, media people, the church, nothing. So there is this feeling of there is this reality of non-democratic non-participation in democracy that must make us, ponder what's going on. And then to what extent the legal economy is affected by the illegal system. An investigation carried out by the Caponetto Foundation says that only in terms of bank deposits in tax havens carried out by mafia people, the figure is 3,000 billion euro deposited there. And the illegal economy in Italy exceeds 100 billion euro. There are some who say even more. And so the real alarm today is doping the legal economy of this country. Well, money laundering still means that you're producing GDP. Even money laundering, goes to GDP. Especially this happens in the peripheral areas. And somehow they are legitimized in situations where, for economic reasons, this is a sort of compulsory choice. But if we don't do something about it, we'll risk the future of democracy, because those who dope the economy don't want to be disturbed by the freedom of the press. They try to do something different. They try to attack the press. And in this country, if we don't end not only mafia attacks, but first and foremost these specious lawsuits, these bogus actions. So as Prosecutor Mr. De Rao did, and a very high percentage of claims in Italy just end up in nothing. They are defined as specious lawsuits. Well, that causes great uncertainty. You can imagine a young journalist who starts working in this peripheral areas that are affected by mafia in Italy, but also abroad. What he does when he gets compensation for €1,000, well, he decides to do something else, and so we lose information. So politics in Italy and Europe doesn't perceive this problem as one of the main problems limiting information. So this is my proposal. We must develop agreed upon actions that are supported also from Unesco to end specious lawsuits, or foreseeing some form of accountability also of those who start such an action For example, making him pay twice as much damages as he has asked. So if you are starting a specious lawsuit, you are going to pay for it, and pay heavily. So the word of information today is being attacked much more than in the past. Everybody is against journalists. Well, the areas of politics, areas of the economy, as well as all the demonstrations. But we know if there is no free information, we have no democracy and no freedom in our country. This is what I think. I think we must go on in this direction, and we must try and keep forms of solidarity and union so as to strengthen the role of free information in Italy, in Europe, but also in the whole world. Thank you for your invitation.
Mikhail Alvarez is actually one of the 24 Italian journalists who live under police protection that were mentioned by Mr. Federico Cafiero de Rao. Actually, his story and his remarks certainly speak for the stories and remarks, I believe, of the other journalists. Michele is a member of Ossigeno per l'informazione, as other ones of those journalists, Lirio Abate, for example, who has been under police protection since 2007. And then, of course, there's many more. So we would like to have them all in mind, of course, when we talk of the story of even just one of them. As for Michele's remarks, I would like to say that, of course, I fully share what he has said. And I would also like to urge you to read our NGO report called Molta Mafia, Poche Notizie, Much Mafia, Little News. Actually, you will find some opinions there of distinguished experts in the field. As for vexatious or bogus claims, I'd like to recall what Pietro Grasso once said about this, namely when he said that unfortunately there's much hypocrisy regarding this within the Italian parliament. He's a member of our NGO, but also the former head of the Italian upper house. So those who go through this particular kind of intimidation and retaliation, we certainly need to develop more tools. And as for us, for our NGO, well, we provide these journalists with free legal aid. Namely, it's a group of journalists who will probably not cover otherwise the expenses, and we do this through an organization based in London, Media Defense. Sab Ashraf, the legal representative of this organization, is here in the audience. Please come up to the podium. I understand Italy is the only country, isn't it, in Italy, at least, that gets some funds for the EU activity. I mean, for the relevant EU activity. I mean, I'm saying this because it is a specialty, if you wish. I mean, it is what makes the situation in Italy so special. Of course, we have the problem, and on the other hand, we also seem to have possible solutions, as this legal aid that seems to be missing in other countries. So, as it is the case for Mafia, whereby we have Mafia, but we also have anti-Mafia, so we have the organized crime known as Mafia, but we also have the best possible political and judicial approaches to fight against it. And it seems like it is also the case of whatever pertains to crimes against journalism. So we seem to be within our time schedule, almost at least, says the speaker. So after Saba's speech, we're going to have a sort of an international overview to conclude our meeting, since we're going to hear the two speakers who are sitting here at the podium. They will be telling us about what happens in the 3 European countries where in these past 4 years journalists have been killed, namely Elena Kaniadakis from Greece, and then Dalia Nasruddin, who is the legal representative of the Caruana Galizia Foundation. And then Thomas Bruning is in the Netherlands and will also be participating. He's a journalist as well as the head of a Dutch trade union in the Netherlands. Only a few months ago, Peter den Velde, the journalist, has been killed. So, having said that, for 10 minutes each, we're going to hear, to listen to these three speakers. Saba, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Alberto, and Unesco, Ossigeno, and all the other partners that have facilitated what's a very important discussion that's being had today. Apologies, my short contribution is going to be in English. I haven't mastered the Italian language yet, but there's hope. So as Alberto mentioned, I work for an organisation called Media Defence. We're a NGO based in London, and our core mission is to ensure legal protection of journalists and independent media who come under threat for reporting on issues of public interest. We've heard from previous speakers how sometimes financial assistance or the lack of can be a barrier in terms of seeking judicial recourse, and primarily that is something that Media Defence wants to try and remedy. So as well as providing legal assistance by way of like research or comparative kind of international standards, as cases go through the domestic or regional courts, we also provide financial assistance to legal cases. And we work globally, so wherever we can, we will get involved, and the two aren't mutually exclusive. So we've been working with, obviously, Ossigeno. We work with other partner organisations across Europe to try and fund cases that are going through the domestic courts, in the hope that there are some strong precedents that are set, and if there is an opportunity then to go to a regional mechanism such as a European court to set a stronger standard and to try and assist in building upon these international standards for protections of journalists. We've heard from many of the speakers today that attacks on journalists are increasing year on year, and this is reflected in our own case docket, so something that we're seeing. And for us, a number of key elements stand out, and I'd like to take my time just to point out two and discuss briefly how these impact when trying to secure accountability through litigation. The first is that these attacks now are shifting, and they're often multifaceted, and they extend beyond a particular territory or a border. The second is the fact that states often lack capacity and ability to carry out proper investigations. So this varies from investigating the crime scene to seeking to establish who was responsible. And I want to give you an example of the first point of this, the fact that attacks are now being carried out across different borders. And I want to give quite a stark and clinical example of a case that media defense has been involved in. And that involves a filing to the European Court on behalf of 4 Armenian citizens following the bombing of a town in Martuni during the recent armed conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. The applicants in those cases, 3 of them were journalists who were injured, and the 4th applicant was the brother of a journalist fixer who was killed. Now, this situation is obviously an outlier, as we often don't see international armed conflicts. We're seeing that that's quite rare in Europe. But what it does do is it demonstrates the length that states are going to try and suppress journalistic reporting, including the targeted bombing of journalists when they are in a conflict zone, to shutting down the internet, which was happening during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict last year. And we can't stress too much the importance of accurate and informed reporting during these kind of conflicts. Reporting has often been, it's impactful on how warring parties behave. So it's very important to kind of see the consideration and seeing the shift that states are now using to try and suppress reporting and journalists from carrying out their jobs. So from our point of view, in terms of litigation, when you are taking these cases forward to courts, whether that be in the domestic or regional mechanism, there needs to be a cooperation across borders, and laws need to be applied uniformly and harmoniously and consistent with human rights standards. So aside from obviously the kind of the stark example of the bombing of journalists, what we're also seeing, and what's kind of been referenced in many of the contributions that speakers have made today, is that of online harassment, and the fact that often the kind of origins of this may not lie, again, within a particular territory or a particular country. Trolling, doxing, comments that are made online are now obviously affecting journalists from an independent media, citizen journalists, bloggers, from carrying out their jobs. The second point, which I kind of want to touch upon in the last few minutes, is that of carrying out a proper investigation to secure a conviction that can withstand an appeal. And we need to ensure, obviously, that there's compliance with Article 6 fair rights standards, and that criminal investigations need to be done thoroughly. So as lawyers, when we are working with other lawyers that are in specific countries, they are finding it difficult in terms of resources, and working with the state prosecution to try and establish where journalists have been victim to some sort of assault, or they're victim to a criminal activity, that those investigations aren't actually being kind of done so thoroughly because of a lack of resources. Often, prosecutors, in some countries aren't even doing their job, despite, journalists, with the help of technical experts, especially in the cases of these kind of online doxing or harassment, are able to provide potentially IP addresses, and there's still a failure on the authorities to go forward and use that information to carry out an effective investigation. Sometimes we see that, they're botched, they're negligent, and sometimes it's just pure corruption on their part. So unfortunately, we're seeing this across the world. Our work is not limited to Europe, but any development that you see in Europe and the application of best practices are definitely benefit journalists across the world. For us, strategic litigation is an important part of a broader kind of approach, and it's an essential part of this broader approach. However, obviously it does depend on the rule of law in the countries and the legitimacy of the courts. So for us, especially building upon a strong precedent of case law from regional mechanism, and often, if there is issues with independence of judiciaries within the domestic system, and there is a possibility to go to a regional mechanism, we see positive results being given. and that forms part of a broader application of interpretation of the law, which we can then use, and cases that are coming out of Europe can be used as part of comparative international standards that are provided to other regions in a concerted effort to find, to establish these best practices and protection for journalists that are obviously doing a very amazing job and need to be supported as best as possible. And one way of doing this is through the litigation that is coming out through the courts. I've lost track of time, but I'm hoping that's my 10 minutes. Again, we're very much interested, Media Defence, in kind of collaborating with journalists, with organisations that are kind of working through the court systems to seek some sort of accountability. Thank you very much.
Well, now, Thomas Bruning now is with us from the Netherlands. Is he with us? Yes, so we can give him the floor. Thomas Bruning. Thank you for the patience, thank you for waiting. Well, this is the final session with a few contributions, and to know what was the feeling in the Netherlands after the killing of Peter der Wellinge. We have here also Elena Kaniadakis, who carried out an investigation on what happened, and of course that is not obvious, or pleasant, what happened in Greece after the killing of Yorgos Karevas on the 9th of April in Athens. And to know also from Nadia Nasreddin, who is the person who works for the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation as a lawyer, as a legal expert, how all these problems that have been made known, also thanks to the international the international uproar after the killing of Caruana Galizia. Matthew Caruana Galizia. I'll start with you, and I can give you the floor for 8 minutes. Thank you.
Speaking from Amsterdam, and I want to give you a short introduction. 4 years ago, we did a broad research in Holland concerning violence against journalists, because we had a feeling that there was an increase. And the outcome of this research was that there was indeed a serious problem among journalists in Holland facing all kinds of threats and violence. I must stress at the same time that we are high in all rankings concerning press freedom in the world. So it was not a situation like you could compare it to states like Russia or Cuba or North Korea, but it was violence that was experienced by journalists in a way that it did interfere with their work as a journalist in the field, and especially in some neighborhoods or on some topics. So we came to the conclusion as a union of journalists that we had to do something about it, more than just encouraging journalists to go to the police and report on a crime or on a harassment. So we joined forces together with the General Prosecutor's Office, the police, the National Police, and the editors-in-chief, the media companies in Holland, to think of ways in which we could come to the sort of main goal. And the main goal would be to make sure that journalists still could do their work also in difficult fields, such as reporting on high-level crime, or going to certain neighborhoods or locations, or opinionate about topics like Islam or these kind of things. This came to an agreement signed by the Minister of Justice in Holland, and this agreement is called persveilig, press safe press. And starting from in this agreement, we did a few things, and all coming from our own responsibilities towards journalists or towards the law. So we agreed upon the fact that the police should always be very serious about when a crime is reported by a journalist, that they would give it priority. Because we experienced before, journalists experienced before that when they came to the police station, they said, well, we'll take notice, or you can come back tomorrow when some violence had taken place. And we had to make sure that the police would take it seriously. With the General Prosecutor's Office, we made an agreement that they would also prioritize these reports and these crimes so that they would give priority to prosecution. But also we agreed upon, because these are offenses against the public interest and against our democracy, that they would ask for double sentences when coming to court. And thirdly, of course, we asked for monitoring. So this means that not only this research we did and we are doing every few years, but also on a daily basis, we are reporting all incidents against journalists in Holland, coming from harassment to physical violence or other kinds of threats. So we all report them, and also the police reports them, so we can see if the promises we made again among each other are being followed. Fourthly, we took the initiative to not only train journalists going to conflict zones in the world, but also train journalists in being aware of their position in Holland when reporting in demonstrations or when going online. And these trainings are really taken seriously by Dutch journalists. So not only the journalists that are reporting on crime, but also journalists that are working in all different fields take these trainings and are more aware how they can cope with threats or with violence against them. And then to come to a conclusion, we also have all kinds of measures that we help our journalists with when they face violence or threats. Large amounts of Dutch journalists work as a freelancer out of their homes. So, for instance, we give them cameras, and we give them body cams or special equipment to be also protected, to be also be protected in their home situation. And I want to stress again, this project in Holland is far beyond, of course, only reporters going on high-level crime. This goes for all sorts of reporting, but I think if you know journalists or if you follow the media, you will see that all over Europe and all over the world, threats against journalists, also in press-free countries like Holland, have been increasing, and so we had to think about an answer. And in persveilig, we found a good answer to join forces and make everybody aware of this, the importance of journalists, that they can continue to do their work, although they are confronted with violence or with threats. Then as a final contribution, of course, I want to say something about the horrible death of our colleague Peter de Vries, Peter R. de Vries, who was a really renowned journalist in Holland. And he has been killed on broad daylight in the center of Amsterdam this summer. And the strange thing, of course, is that at one hand, I'm quite proud to present this whole initiative we have came to in Holland, because I think we are one of the first in Europe or even in the world of joining forces in this way. And at the same time, we see still that a thing like the horrible murder on Peter de Vries, which is also, I want to stress out, the first murder in 20 years' time against a journalist in Holland, has occurred. And you could ask the question, how can it be that when you're working so good together and when you have all these agreements on protection, that still something like this can happen? And I want to stress out that Peter de Vries has been a victim of a sort of mafia group here in Holland that really that you can almost impossible defend against. So, and Peter de Vries himself decided also that he didn't want the sort of protection that, for instance, the former speaker, Mr. Albanese, is offered in Italy and also was offered to him here in Holland. So it's not that we were not prepared in a way that we were not aware of the risks that a criminal reporter such as Peter de Vries was taking. But there's always also a personal decision of a journalist if he wants to go as far as a sort of protection on a daily basis, which of course involves a lot of, which comes very deep into your private life. So what we've seen this summer is something that we just were not expecting to happen, and at the same time, so it's really an exception, and at the same time, it's a warning and it's a sign that the Mafia, which operates in Italy, has also branches or similar kind of organizations in countries like Holland, and that we have to be prepared for this specific group of journalists to also take measures that are going further than the protection we can offer in the Persveilig initiative. And therefore we also think that as a part of our initiative Persveilig, we also are going to Italy to learn from the experiences they have had in the past and in the present in protecting these group of journalists, because we think it's very important that they can continue their work in this very important field, and so we hope that we can provide with a sort of protection in this specific field that can make it possible to continue their work there. I think this is the basic contribution I wanted to give. There's one thing I want to stress out, because I'm now addressing to an international audience, and that is that the example I'm giving with Persveilig, where we cooperate with the National Police, the General Prosecutor's Office, and the media companies, can only be possible if there's a basic level of trust among these parties. For instance, I gave a presentation before at the Council of Europe, and if you see some countries, like in Eastern Europe or like Belarus, of course it's not thinkable that you can come to such a cooperation, because if the police is behaving not in a proper way against journalists themselves, or if the General Prosecutor's Office doesn't take regard of the protection of sources, then a cooperation like we are doing in Holland is bound to fail, because then there's a lack of trust and there's no possibility to cooperate with each other. I would leave it at this point, and I'm of course open for questions.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks a lot. Thanks for talking once again about the need for international cooperation and how to carry it out. We'll get back to it maybe at a later stage. We are now at the very end of our meeting. We might do with some delay, because now Elena has the floor, and then Dalia Elena Kaniadakis first, and then Daria Nasreddin. So, Elena, you have carried out an investigation on what's happening in Greece. We actually published it on our Ossigeno per l'informazione website, both in Italian and in English. Can you tell us what that was about? I mean, I was quite impressed when I went through it, namely by the difference with the situation in Italy, which is not exactly heaven, but still it seems to be much better. So can you tell us about the main differences? Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Let me start by recalling the most tragic event that occurred last April in Greece. Yorgos Karavas, the investigative journalist, was killed in Athens by two killers whose traces were lost, so much so that today we still don't know about either their identities or the reason behind the killing. And Kostas Katsivakis, another journalist, was later put under police protection because of life-threatening activities against and approaches against him. Well, actually, the Greek government has done virtually nothing since then. Actually, there is a reform bill of the Greek criminal code whereby some sanctions and also imprisonment are envisaged for those who publish fake news. And differently from what has happened in Malta, for example, in Greece, there hasn't even been a significant reaction by civil society, and I believe that these two elements are enough for us to understand what the situation is like in Greece regarding freedom of the press. I might mention other episodes, namely the arbitrary arrest of journalists as they are working. It has been it has been recalled differently from Italy, where generally speaking journalists trust the law enforcement officers protecting them. Well, that is not the case in Greece. Maxavanis, when he wrote an article about his story, said that actually the readers are the only protection that he may actually get. So that was also furtherly, aggravated by the claim of some interferences by the government. The PETSAS list, for example, whereby 20 million euro funding was given by the government, and that was the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that was quite arbitrary. In other words, the funding was for newspapers, but basically for those newspapers that were particularly close to the Greek government. Other newspapers, much more important, but less close to the government, were ruled out of this funding, and censorship as well as interferences were carried out also within TV networks. We know of some suffocating pressures with the journalists. Actually, the government had been criticized for their management of the COVID-19 crisis. Well, anyway, Elena's report in its long form can be found on Ossigeno homepage. You'll find several details in there. I believe you want to end with the two elements. Well, first of all, this is a political problem. We need more pressure from the European countries. Actually, many readers among the Greek population read also international newspapers. And then we know about the economic crisis of Greece. Trade unions are therefore very weak because mainly they want to protect journalists in terms of their jobs. And we know about privatization of jobs, which is typical of Greece as well as Italy. We know that the journalists dealing with Mafia are often freelance journalists. However, those of my generation who want to become journalists for a long time are often forced into being a freelance journalist. So this is an issue that may get more and more of a key issue. Thank you.
Well, despite the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia and that the public investigation was recently concluded in Malta, our situation is very precarious. They are threatened even though the state did find that the state itself was guilty in a way because they created a climate of impunity whereby also becoming a journalist was a threat to life, and the people who were the ideators of the murder felt free to do that because they did not fear the consequences. The Maltese state still must implement the recommendations of the prosecutors who carried out the public investigation. So we're waiting for that to happen. Journalists are under the so-called slap suits, and we work with other organizations so that the European Union can protect against slap suits, but we are convinced that member states and the heads of state must not wait for the European Union to do something, but they should be doing something themselves. And this investigation, this journalistic investigation, must also turn into judiciary investigations. This did not happen for Daphne because she had carried out many investigations, and we're still waiting for these investigations to be picked up by prosecutors. But this is not happening for other journalists who are still luckily alive, and they're carrying out investigations on the corruption in the government. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You are truly excellent. We are over time, so I'm going to close with a sentence. First of all, I wish to thank all speakers. And I consider this dialogue, this roundtable today, as the starting point of a new mode of interaction that I hope may continue in a variety of ways, also online, of course, so that we can put together both practical, so best practices, first of all, and keeping in mind also the scientific level of the issues, because of course there is an emotional level that is important, but of course it's not the only one, and further stressing the idea of what to do, making proposals, because it's high time we did that. We know that the problem is there. The problem is there. We are all very well aware of this problem. It is a disease that is well present, and so now we must try and find the best drugs to treat this disease. There are many experimental drugs, so to speak, best practices such as NGOs, Ossigeno, and also the final contributions give us excellent indications. So now the video that UNESCO has prepared is just a few minutes video, and that was prepared to celebrate this day to end impunity for crimes against journalists. This is the UNESCO video to close the meeting.
These are journalists. Your perception of them might be positive or negative, depending on your view. But have you considered that they are protecting your right to public information? The information we receive shapes our world. But imagine if those who protect our access to it are removed by people who want to prevent certain information becoming public. What world would that shape? In 2010, 2 young journalists working as interns for a local Mexican newspaper were sitting in a parked car outside of a mall when gunmen opened fire, killing 21-year-old Luis Carlos Santiago Orozco and severely injuring his 18-year-old colleague. The killers fled, but the operation was indicative of a drug cartel settling a score. The cartel's target was the newspaper the victims worked for because, unlike some other media agencies in the city, their newspaper had still been reporting on drug war-related crimes. However, this was the second killing of one of its journalists in 2 years, which led the newspaper to respond with a front-page editorial addressing the cartels. In it, they directly asked them what they should be publishing to avoid further death, injury, and intimidation of its staff. This is how a zone of silence begins, where reporting is no longer independent but controlled by those with power, like drug lords, corrupt officials, businessmen, and politicians. A zone where people cannot access information freely because journalists feel too threatened to report the news. Crimes against journalists are not just limited to a handful of countries. They occur anywhere where the powerful and corrupt want to hide the truth. That means in almost every country, attacks against journalists are committed, including harassment, intimidation, arbitrary imprisonment, kidnappings, violent attacks, and murder. Since 1993, 1,438 journalists have been killed, but the more shocking fact is that for every 10 cases of journalists murdered, only 1 ends in successful prosecution of the perpetrators. These killings include those dying while reporting armed conflict, but the majority are killed in countries without armed conflict, where journalists are uncovering local stories that some would prefer hidden. In many cases, those involved in these crimes are powerful enough to obstruct investigations and justice, but in other cases, impunity comes from bottlenecks within the justice system itself. In some countries, it's due to justice systems lacking human and financial resources. In others, it's due to corruption and a lack of transparency. While in some cases, it's a lack of knowledge of good practices to investigate these crimes. This often results in the killing of a journalist just being considered a common crime that has no connection to their profession. These shortcomings in justice systems lead to cases taking many years to resolve, if at all. They represent a breakdown in security and the rule of law, which furthers a cycle of violence against journalists. And where does this lead? To the expansion of global zones of silence. Zones where only powerful people decide the news you hear. Zones which violate our freedom of expression and our collective right as a society to access information. So, how do we solve this? The way forward starts with acknowledging the complexity of these crimes and considering them as crimes against freedom of expression, not just individuals. Central to solving this issue are judicial actors, those responsible for investigating and prosecuting these crimes. Collective knowledge of how to break the cycle of impunity is required to solve the issue, and efforts are currently being made to address this. UNESCO, for instance, is offering global online training, aiming to increase the understanding of international freedom of expression standards among judicial actors and law enforcement agencies. Support is being offered to journalists for their legal battles against attacks to silence them. And investigative journalist networks are working to resolve the crimes against their fellow journalists while uncovering the stories that the perpetrators attempted to hide. But this is just a start. The solution still requires the collective efforts of member states, United Nations agencies, civil society organizations, regional human rights courts, and all judicial actors. So, if you're an actor in the judicial system, you can learn from successful prosecutions of crimes against journalists in other parts of the world and use these teachings to pursue cases in your own country. Because the best way to protect our journalists, to protect our collective rights, is not to give up on these cases, but to bring the perpetrators to justice. As always, the solution begins with awareness of the problem. So, by sharing this message, even if you feel that you're not directly involved, you are contributing to a global effort to end crimes against journalists and protecting freedom of expression and information.